It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tessie Rose Bailey. Dr. Bailey has been supporting the Wyoming Department of Education and local educators for the last 5 years. She is the principal consultant for the National Center on Intensive Intervention and director of the Center on Multi-Tiered Systems of Support, as well as the director of the New Progress Center, which promotes progress for students with disabilities at the American Institute for Research. So, welcome, Dr. Bailey.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks everyone for allowing me to share some of the resources that we have coming out of the National Center on Intensive Intervention. So today I'll be talking about K-12 goal writing strategies, and there are 2 handouts that were provided for today's session. You can find those handouts in the chat box and the link, and we're not going to use them right away, but they will be helpful for later on in the session, so take some time to either download those, or if you have the ability to print, you can do that as well. So before we get started, I just want to share a little bit about me. I am a parent of 2 children with disabilities. Both have benefited from a multi-tiered system of support. I'm actually a former teacher and a recovering faculty member who used to work at Montana State University in Billings, which is where I was when I first started working with the Wyoming Department of Ed. As Tom mentioned, I do work with a number of national centers, and these are centers that are funded by the U.S. Department of Education through various federal acts, including the IDEA and some of the ESSA work that's coming out. And so what I'm sharing with you today are resources that were developed by teachers for teachers and then vetted through a series of steps. All the way up through the U.S. Department of Ed, and then are disseminated for folks to really improve their practice and use existing resources, so we don't have to come up with everything. What I would like to do is just learn a little bit about you all, and I'm going to try to do some engagement strategies today. So I really encourage you to use your chat box as much as you can. If you can just give me a sense about who you are, and then just in the chat box, let me know just sort of the roles that you play, the region or the school district that you're representing, and that will kind of give me a sense about, you know, what levels within the educational system I'm interacting with. I don't know, Tom, if I can see everything. Oh, I can. Good. All right, Laurel. So we have some special ed directors, at-risk coordinators, counselors, lots of WDE folks, parent advocates, great, consultants, teachers, transition coordinators, excellent. Great, so we have a wide variety of folks at the elementary, the secondary level, and at the administration level, as well as at the teacher level, which I think is great. Awesome. So I encourage you to ask questions throughout, and I have asked Tom to interrupt me at any time that is appropriate for your question. I don't want you to have to wait till the very end or for a particular section if the question that you need answered is relevant right now. Tom will also be chiming in every now and then, and just to share some local experiences. As Tom mentioned, I've been in the state for about 5 years, and have been working with Tom to support educators in developing goals. And so there's a lot of lessons learned about how that might actually improve your practice as well. Right. So I have one more chat activity, and I want you to think about your experience with goal setting and think about which one really best describes you, right? Or which picture. And what I don't want you to do is press enter. So right now, I just want you to put your number, don't press enter until I say go. And what we're gonna do is called a chatterfall. And what it does is everybody's thing will start posting at the same time to really give you a sense about the broad skills or knowledge and skills that exist within this group. I'm gonna give you just a couple more seconds. See which one best represents to you. And I'm gonna do it on the count of 3. And on the count of 3, I want you to select enter to post your number, okay? 1, 2, 3. So Look at that. So we refer to that as a chatterfall. And if you look at that, you can see that there's quite a range. A lot of folks in the center, that 2 to 4, which is really important because some of the questions that folks might ask today may be a little bit higher and you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think about that. While some other folks may be asking some questions that really, because they're new to this process. And I want to be able to respect all of the knowledge levels that we have in this group. So please feel free to ask your question at any time, even if you think it's silly, because I guarantee there's another person who probably would have asked the same question. So as I mentioned, there are 2 handouts, and these handouts were developed by the National Center on Intensive Intervention, and they're based on about 2 decades of research in ways that we think about developing goals, particularly IEP goals. Now, the way we developed IEP goals are essentially the same as if we would develop goals for instructional objectives or instructional reasons, or if we were doing an intervention goal. The same strategies apply. And so these are great resources because it really breaks down the process for your team to sort of think about each of those steps. The point is to make this process simpler. Now, a lot of you put 2 or 3, and if you remember on that 3, we've really, like, this is really driving me nuts. It seems so arbitrary, it's really difficult. And what the resources were meant to do is to really break it down into these manageable tasks so that we feel confident in what we're doing with our goal setting, right? I have to be able to explain to a parent or a kid or another teacher why I set the goal the way I set it. And sometimes we just don't feel as confident as we would like to. Now, I wanted to start off with saying there are some things that are pushing us to really pay attention to goal setting. Now, goal setting has always been a critical piece of our work, from classroom teacher designing instruction to a interventionist setting up intervention goals to a special ed teacher who's developing special ed IEP goals. Now, in 2017, Endrew decision really forced us to rethink the way that we're looking at goal setting, right? There was a lot of concerns about arbitrary goals, vague goals, and the decision really is forcing us to say, wow, is this goal helping a child make progress that's appropriate in light of their child's circumstances? And in this case, it was a student with disabilities, autism in particular, who was not making progress in a way that the parent thought was appropriate. And what they found is that while the kid was making progress, it was so minimal, right, that it wasn't really relevant to the student. And so the decision really forced us to look more at challenging goals to help kids move beyond sort of the de minimis, right, the minimum expectation for growth. And it comes down to when we look at progress monitoring, which we won't cover today, but goal setting is relevant, is that we are the ones based on our goals that determine whether we're expecting challenging growth or are we really just expecting some growth, right? And that's where this Supreme Court decision said, you know, across the country, we want to make sure that it's appropriate in light of those circumstances. Now, in the 2 books that I shared, they're structured in a similar way. And one is to think about what is it that we're trying to measure. And while it seems really simple and we can pull some of those things out, it probably is one of the more complex pieces of goal setting. And I think it's why a lot of us struggle. We also then, once we've identified what we want kids to do or the measure in which we want to look at how they do that skill on, we have to establish a baseline. And these 2 things sometimes, if we're implementing an MTSS system, become a lot easier. It's when we don't have infrastructure like screening or benchmarking in our school that selecting the measure and target can become quite challenging. So I'm going to talk about some considerations when you're looking at the target and the measure and how we would think about setting the baseline, which is essential for us to really setting a challenging goal for the student that's also realistic. Now, the 3rd and 4th steps are probably what you came for. You're like, how do I set the goal, right? What is the number going to be? How do I know that it's measurable? Well, once we've got the target in the baseline, in reality, if we use 3 validated strategies, we can probably set a really good goal for the student that we could justify, right? And that's really what we're trying to do. And once we've got all those pieces, then we can actually put it on paper. Now, selecting the target in the measure, as I mentioned, can be really challenging. And what we have found is that a lot of educators sometimes confuse things like progress monitoring with monitoring of progress. And a lot of us think, well, heck, I'm already looking at that. I already have these instructional goals for the student. But in order for us to really understand what's a realistic goal, we have to understand what is it that we want to measure. So I'm going to talk about 2 different approaches to thinking about this measurement selection or the target behaviors that we're looking for. On the left-hand side, you'll see what we refer to as single skill measure, or maybe you've heard about it as mastery measure. And what it's doing is it's taking these discrete skills and setting a goal for each discrete skill. So if I have my 9 times tables, I might set a goal that I want 100% accuracy. Or if it's staying in their seat, I want to set it at 80%. But what I'm looking at is setting a goal for a specific behavior, right? Not a bunch of behaviors that might be like academic engagement, which encompasses a lot of behaviors, or reading connected text, or math calculation that goes beyond just a single type of calculation. So we can progress monitor and set goals using single skill measures, but there are some limitations that I'll share. And some of those limitations is that, is it really meaningful to the student? So for example, I could set a goal that says this kid is going to be able to decode nonsense words. And you say, okay, well, that makes sense. And I could set the goal for the student and measure progress towards that. But the question really becomes, does it matter, right? If the kid achieves mastery of that particular skill, does it really equate to better skills in reading or literacy? And we need another measure to help us understand is, does the kid's mastery of being able to decode these nonsense words actually translate or generalize to general reading, right, or reading connected text? So we often look at what are referred to as general outcome measures. And I'm going to show an example of both of these to give you a sense, because it makes a difference on how we set the goal. Now, general outcome measures look at what is it that we want the kid to be able to do. So if we think about behavioral skills within a classroom, I might want my kid to pay attention to me when I'm talking. I want him to have his materials. I want him to stay seated. I could do a mastery measure and measure each one of those. So I would have a goal for each one of those. Or I could have a measure of academic engagement, which would encompass all of those behaviors. So that's when we sort of think about general outcomes. It's the same for reading or math, is there are discrete behaviors like reading sight words or decoding or phonological awareness that are essential to reading. But it's really this general outcome is, can the kid actually read, that we care about? So when we set our goal, we look at, are we most interested in the individual skill? Are we more interested in, can the kid use these skills for a purpose, right? That's something that has a value to the kid. Now, sometimes we get mixed up in these things because we sometimes confuse monitoring progress with progress monitoring. And I want to make it clear, because when we think about monitoring progress and we try to set a goal, it becomes really challenging. And in fact, we can't really use a lot of the validated goal setting strategies to monitor progress, because the goals are often even more specific than what we were talking about with a single skill measure. So when we think about monitoring progress, a good teacher does this every single day. They watch their students, they grade papers, they do little quick checks, engagement activities, thumbs up, thumbs down. And these are things that we do during instruction that allow us to see right away our kids getting it. And we use that information in real time as I see my kids are crying or are struggling. And so what I do is I stop and I reteach or re-explain. So I have this really immediate effect within minutes, seconds, right? And we use it for all students. It's just part of being a really good teacher. It's considered a high leverage practice. Now, when we think about progress monitoring, which is really essential for goal setting, is that we're looking at something that's standardized. Because in order for us to set a goal, we have to be clear that we're assessing that kid on the same goal every single time. So if I have a goal of reading, the grade level expectation of 90 words read correct, then the way that I monitor or progress monitor the student is assessing their progress towards that 90 words read correct, right? There's some standardized way in which I can look at growth over time. Now, the difference between progress monitoring and monitoring progress is progress monitoring requires me to collect data and graph it over time. So the use of a goal has meaning, right? Is that I'm not looking at what the kid can do right now. I'm looking at what the kid's going to be able to do in 8 weeks or 16 weeks. So the goal has a purpose, where it doesn't really have a goal. The goal itself doesn't have the same purpose in monitoring progress, right? I'm not going to graph my observations of students on something, but I would do that with progress monitoring. Now, I want to be clear that setting these types of goals isn't for every single kid, and it's often limited to like 20 to 25% of students who are receiving some supplemental instruction, right? Because this is where we want to be able to use that goal to make a decision about whether a kid is progressing or not progressing, right? Now, I want to show you an example is just sort of to illustrate the differences between this monitoring of progress and progress monitoring, and also this difference between a single skill measure or something you might see within an intervention to what's more of like a general outcome measure. All right, so wish me luck here.
The black and white dog was very smart. He hid his bones all over his yard. He hid his bones in the shadows of the trees. He hid his bones under the swing set. Evan hid his bones. The dog was always happy. He was never without a bone. He only chewed on one bones. One day the dog was sleeping. A rat came into his yard. The black and white dog.
So I'm curious, what do you all see? Is this more of a general outcome measure, or do you see this more of a single skill measure for this student? So Megan, we've got some single skills. Thanks for participating, Megan. You get kudos. Karen said general outcome, general, yeah. So in reality, this is a general outcome because one of the big outcomes that we want out of school is for kids to be able to read. And in order for us to be able to set a goal, we have to have some parameters or ways to describe a kid who's at what would be a proficient level of reading from a kid who's not at a proficient level of reading. So the standardization that you see here is that the kid read for 1 minute. There is a standard scoring approach. Allows us to have something in which we can compare the student over time. And because of that, it allows us to set a goal. We can go anywhere in the country and say, we would expect a first grader in, the second semester of the school year to be able to read these numbers of words read correctly in this period of time, right? So there's a parameter, and this is 1 minute. If you think about a general outcome for a kid to be able to read this text, he has to have multiple levels of skill, right? To decode, to read his sight words, probably has, phonological awareness. And we can also attend to things like prosody, and does he pause at the punctuation, right? So is he attending to other features of reading? So this is what we would see as more of a general outcome. It's not perfect, but the research over the last 3 decades it's a good indicator of how students are reading, and thus it can become a good measure to really be able to set a goal. Now I want to show this one, and I'm not going to show the full video, but as you're watching it, write in the chat box, what's your thinking about what type of measure this is?
I got my face completed.
Oh, you're moving on to a new level? All right.
So you said
You
this
ready?
moved to a new level.
Get the date, 9:30. All right, and we're going to start with this word.
Could. Would. Were. When. One. Will.
Point for you. Nice job. Now we're going to try to get some new words. We're going to move on to
See a
the
couple folks writing in the
words.
chat box.
Okay, read right across, honey.
Big. Way.
Now.
Now. Victory.
Very.
Ride.
Good. So I see a couple people, everyone so far is writing in what they see is a single skill measure, right? It's looking at this measure of sight words, right? Which is a critical skill. And it's not that we're not going to monitor progress, which is exactly what she's doing, but it may not be a valid goal that we would set for a student, because just mastering sight words doesn't mean I'm going to become a proficient reader, right? So that's where we think about when we're setting a goal, what type of measure are we going to use? These are great for instructional goals or determining when the student moves to the next level. But in terms of us really understanding, is this kid making progress towards more proficient reading? I'm not so sure. It's an indicator that he's learning some skills necessary for proficiency. But until I can see the kid read, I'm not really sure, are they taking these discrete single skills of learning, you know, how and very and could, and do they use that in context, right? So that's kind of what we're thinking about. And if you do choose a single skill measure, which you completely can, you have to be able to justify why you're choosing a very specific single skill measure. And how will you know if meeting the goal that you set for the student actually has any value for the student, right? Does it help them be better in math or in reading or writing? Now, people ask a lot about behavior, and the same thing applies. If we look at the two main ways in which we monitor or progress monitor in behavior, we look at systematic direct observations. A lot of you are probably very familiar with, and is a little more similar to a single skill, to a comparison of something like a direct behavior rating, which is a little more like a general outcome measure. So I'll show you an example. So we think about a systematic direct observation, you find a specific skill that you want to monitor the student on. And so if I was going to use this as my measure for goal setting, I would have to make some decision about what it is that I need the kid to do, whether it's stay in their seat for a period of time or raise their hand, ask for help, or whatever it might be. And the ways that we often think about these single skills is the number of times they do it, the length or duration of times they do it. And if we think about it as a single skill, it's easy. I want the kid to stay in their seat for at least 10 minutes without any prompts, right? So that would be duration, but it's a specific skill. Because if you think about it, I could have the kids sit in their seat, but do completely terrible things, right? Like throw stuff up and talk out and mess around, but their rear end never leaves the seat. And so when we think about what do we really want to happen, while I want the kid to stay in their seat, I also want them to have their materials, be looking at the speaker, be quiet, right? So I'm looking more at this general behavior that would indicate that they're ready for learning or are engaged in the learning. And so that's where there's a lot of research coming out in the last decade around measures like direct behavior ratings that we can use for goal setting. And it's establishing what it is that you expect the kid to do, right? Outlining those specific behaviors. And you can see right here, this behavior description. I just pointed to my screen like you could see that. But behavior descriptions, I want the kid to remain in their seat, keep their pencil in their hand, have their book open, use a quiet voice. So instead of a single skill that we're expecting the kid to do, it's more of a description of a behavior that we're looking to see much more broadly. So here's an example of what one might look like is this idea of academic engagement. And there's a description of what they're talking about, and this could be active or passive. And we would describe what that behavior would look like, right? So it's a bunch of things, not a single skill: raising hand, reading silently, book open. And the way that we would progress monitor is using a rating in which the teacher looks and says at the end of that class period, the student was academically engaged based on our description 60% of the time. Or it could be 80% or 90% or no, 0%. But having this indicator, right, of what we are expecting the kid to do allows us to say, this is the goal that we're going to set for the student. Similar to their same age peers, kids are 80% of the time are academically engaged. So we're going to monitor or progress monitor to see how quickly the student reaches that 80%, right? So we just have to be clear about, are we looking at a single skill for behavior, or are we looking at something that's a little more general success? So not disruptive behaviors. I mean, there's some that are already out there, or you could just read your own. Now, some things to consider when you're looking at your key characteristics is we want things that are brief, right? So when we're setting a goal, we want a tool that can be easily progress monitored. If it takes us 30 minutes to get the data point each time, it probably could be a good goal, but it's not really going to be the best goal that we could use for the student. We want to make sure that it allows for repeated measures. So for example, we wouldn't use the Woodcock-Johnson and say we want the kid to score at a certain percentile rank, because we can't repeat that over time. We want to make sure that the tools that we're using have some level of growth, because without that, how am I supposed to know what would be a realistic goal? And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit. And then we want to make sure that it's measuring age-appropriate outcomes. So I know we have folks from transition level and folks from, the early elementary. Each of you are going to have measures that are appropriate to your grade span as well as the domain of interest. So the tools chart that you see here on the right-hand side, and we can take a gander at this if you'd like, but it could be its own training, really helps folks understand what are the measures that are available for us to set goals. And does the tools that actually exist right now, so if you're using, let's say, FastBridge or AimsWeb or Dibbles, whatever it might be, you can see, does it meet these criteria of a measure that's appropriate for goal setting? And if you look at the tools chart here, I have too many windows, you can see there's the first tab that says performance level standards, growth standards, and usability. And that usability tab will say, yes, there are some growth rates there or some benchmarks. And the sole purpose is to help you set goals. So once you've got your measure, so it's not as easy as we would like, but once we've identified the appropriate measure based on the student's needs and the outcomes we're looking at, the next step is to establish baseline. And baseline is essential for us to really understand where kids are starting. Because if we set the same goal for every kid, a kid who's closer to the goal is going to have an easier time than a kid who's so far away from the goal, it's just not even realistic. And the distance from the goal, the grade level goal, actually is a good measure of whether this student needs intensive support versus, let's say, secondary or supplemental support at tier 2. So when we establish the baseline, there are a couple of approaches that we can take. The easiest, and I would recommend it, is to take your benchmark. So if you're using a behavior measure or an academic measure, if you did benchmark screening, that would be your best baseline to use, as long as the way that you're going to progress monitor the student is using the same tool. And most systems are set up like that. The other thing that you can do, let's say you create your own direct behavior rating, or the kid showed up mid-year and you don't really have baseline or screening data or benchmark data, you could just create your own baseline. The recommendation is to do like 3 probes over a period of time. If they're longer probes, maybe they're 10 or 15-minute long probes. But if they're short probes, like those we could do in a minute or 2 minutes, we could just do them all 3 at the same time. And then you take the median of 3 probes done at the same time, or the mean of 3 probes done over time. And I'll show you an example of what that looks like. But it's almost like you're repeating your screening or benchmarking that you missed in the fall or the winter. There is some research, and you'll see this in the behavior goal setting guide that I shared, is with behavior, sometimes we need a little bit more data to really get a stable baseline. And so the recommendation is sometimes to gather up to 5 data points to really understand where you're starting. And this may be really critical for behaviors that don't necessarily occur that frequently, right? That you might need a couple of weeks or a couple of days to really get a good baseline so you can set a good goal for that student. Now, if those of you who are looking for goal setting, in the guides, you'll see that the baseline that you would use for your goal should be found in your present levels of academic and functional performance. And they should really be written almost in the same way that you would write the goal. So if I'm going to write a goal that says, when given a 3rd grade level passage, he's going to get to 90 words read correct, I want to make sure that my baseline is saying, when given 3rd grade passages, this is what he does now, right? Now, we often graph, and I'll talk about the importance of graphing, but we can't always include the graph in our IEP. So a good way to include that is just to write the measurable baseline for the student and the conditions under which that baseline was collected. Now, I mentioned there are 2 ways, and I point this out because you will need this information for our activity, but there are 2 ways to think about it. I mentioned a mean and a median. And the mean is really the average, right? Is that I add the scores together and I divide by however many scores there are. So in this case, you'll see the scores were 3, 6, and 7. And so I add those together and I divide by 3. That is a good approach, but sometimes what happens is if I have an outlier, let's say the kid completely bombed one of them, but did really well in the other, the average can actually bring down what we see as a good baseline. So the other option is using the median. And the median is that you rank the scores in order from lowest to highest, and then you just take the middle score. And those of you who do things like CBM passages, Ames-Webb, FastBridge, or curriculum-based measures, that's really what happens at screening. You do 3 passages and then you take the middle score. And that kind of looks like this, right? Is that you're really just trying to rule out, are there outliers, and get a good sense about where this kid is. So in this case, the kid got an 83, a 72, and a 79. we would take the middle score for the student. We also do the same with the errors. And this is kind of, doesn't really make sense to a lot of people, but you can see on this last one, the kid made a lot of errors. But it could be that the kid made a lot of errors on one and very few errors on another. So we don't want the errors on one to really, sort of bring down what would be a more average score or a more typical representation of the student's baseline. So this is what it would look like if you're conducting them over multiple days. Let's say you're using a tool like STAR Literacy or maybe the adaptive measure parts of FastBridge, where the tool itself takes a lot longer. I'm not going to sit the kid down for like 3 data points and say, well, you're going to do this for 20 minutes, another one for 20 minutes, and another one for 20 minutes, that you could actually collect those data points over time, and that's where you might take a mean score. Some folks with those types of adaptive measures, though, do just tend to use a single administration, like what you would do with them. All right, so now what you probably came for is really, so what, right? Like I picked my measure, I know I'm gonna monitor the student on this, I've set the baseline for the student. How do I know what's going to be a good goal? And this is a really big decision, because setting the goal too low, the kid might not get the services they need. Setting the goal too high might make it appear that the kid is not doing as well and you're providing services the kid doesn't need. So it's this really fine line, and making sure that we feel really confident in our decisions is really important. So there are 3 validated approaches to setting academic goals, and then I'll share with the behavior goals as well. The same sort of principles apply to behavior, but what you'll find is that there are no published benchmarks and there's no national norms for growth, right? What's the growth on sitting in your seat? That just doesn't really exist. So what we're looking for are tools in academics that have established growth rates and benchmarks. So you have a handout in your packet, and it's in the back. It summarizes these goal setting strategies. So don't feel like you've got to write all the notes down. The session is being recorded, but it's kind of like a cheat sheet. And the cheat sheet's nice. It's just like what a doctor might do is, I'm going to follow my checklist or my script to make sure that I'm considering all the potential options. Now, regardless of the approach that you set, whether it's academic or behavior, you have to be able to explain how the goal was set. You have to be able to explain why it was set that way, and then really make a case then for why the intervention or specially designed instruction that you're putting in place is reasonably calculated to help the kid reach that goal. And this is where we often get a little bit nervous, right? Is that we can't confidently say why we're setting it like that. Using the strategies that I'll share today, you can say these align with national norms. They align with national benchmarks. We know if students get here, this means that they're ready for the next learning period, whether it's moving to middle school or the next grade level. The other thing about the goal that I think a lot of people don't realize is it is what helps you determine which interventions you should use, not the other way around. So if I have my baseline for the student and we've set the goal at a certain level, what I'm looking for is an intervention intensity that's going to get the kid to the goal, right? And that can help me say, well, gosh, this kid needs to make way more growth than this other kid. So the supports given to this student look more like intensive intervention or tier 3 than a student who doesn't need to make as much growth to meet that goal. Now, goals are also really important because it says a lot about what we think about student performance. And if you look here, if just on the surface, if I was a parent and I'm looking at this, my first instinct is to say, wow, here's the goal. This is where my kid was here at the beginning, and this gray line is my kid. Wow, my kid made progress towards their goal. The challenge here is that I don't know as a parent if that goal means anything. And in reality, this goal was an arbitrarily set goal, that the teacher set the goal based on where they thought the student should be. if they really looked at standard approaches, what they would find is that in order for a kid to really be successful in whatever grade level they were in, the goal actually needed to be here. So we're not setting goals where we hope kids will get or where we think kids will get. We're setting goals where kids need to be in order to access the curriculum, to be successful in their next learning period or be successful on the state test, whatever is the outcome you're interested in. So setting the goal really determines what you're thinking about is relevant for the student. And we want to set challenging goals that mean something to kids when they get that goal. With that said, then the best way to set a goal is to use benchmarks. So in this case, the benchmark or the kid's baseline was here. We know that the benchmark for the kid to be on grade level is set at 90 words read correct on this measure. Every measure has their own benchmarks. And that's where we set the goal. So if I had to tell the parent, I set the goal at 90 because I know the student, in order for them to be successful in third grade, needs to be proficient, and proficiency at this grade level is 90 words read correct, right? So then we would select an intervention or whatnot that would help the student make that level of growth to achieve that goal. Now, some of you may not really be interested in long-term, year-long goals, and you just want to set a quarter goal, right? You did your fall benchmark, and you're gonna set it, for the winter, and then we're gonna reevaluate. So benchmarks can be used really at any time, but just understanding that the benchmarks do represent a time, like what a kid would need to know in September or January or even in May. So that we then often set our intervention goals based on those chunks of time. The other thing about it is it's really clean, it's easy to do, and there are data that's out there to help us do it. So if you already own a tool, then it's probably embedded within your system. Most tools right now have established benchmarks that would allow you to just set a standard goal. And in fact, most intervention tools will recommend the benchmark as the goal that you should use. But let's say you're like, I'm not going to purchase anything. There are free things out there to help you set goals in reading, math, writing, spelling, so that you can use measures that you download, standardized measures, or you create for yourself. So they don't have to be purchased. I just know a lot of people do that because it's a lot easier to facilitate. And those of you who are using common tools like Ames, Web, or FastBridge, sometimes they set goals or benchmarks for different tiers. So let's say you have a kid who's well below grade level benchmark, and the likelihood that the kid would be able to make that much growth from 0 to the grade level benchmark at 30 is just not realistic. They also provide things like a tier 2 benchmark or a sort of winter benchmark that's maybe more realistic that the student can get to. So I would check out your tools to see what are the available resources to help you utilize what we already know about performance on this measure that we have for this grade span at this time. So I just want to stop real quickly so I get a sense about what measures you're using and see if there are any questions. If you can just real quickly in the chat box, if you already have a published system, type it in the chat box. I'm just using Ames Web and FastBridge because I know there's a couple of schools, school districts in the state using that, but are you using other tools that have these benchmarks? Yeah, Ames Web, FastBridge, yeah, probably the most common. Lisa did a good pick on those. Now I do know that there are some screening tools that are used in the state in which there may not necessarily be a benchmark. And this can be a challenge in goal setting because you don't really know what's expected. And so the team would really probably have to do their own data analysis to identify what scores are our students getting that are predictive of the outcome of interest, which could be your state test or something else. So you can create them. Classroom assessments, classroom assessments aren't really considered benchmarks, primarily because they're not validated right? They're based on standards, so they're more standards-based instruction, which is critical, but they often fall under what we consider to be monitoring of progress towards standards. And what we're looking at is progress monitoring of skills necessary for kids to access and benefit from standards. So I hope that helps, Joe. Very common. Yeah, it's a very common question. And I will say that teachers can create their own tools, but if you are a special ed teacher and you're creating your own tools, just know that if you ever had to go to court, you're going to have to justify whether those are valid and reliable tools for monitoring progress or progress monitoring for that particular student. And in some cases, we can create our own. As I just showed some tools, you know, there are tools in which you can do it, but it's about the delivery of a standardized measure each time. So I know back in the day when I was a teacher, we actually did create our own benchmark tools and progress monitoring tools, and we worked with the university to help us develop the or sort of tease out the psychometric properties so we could be confident. I don't think most people like doing that now, though. People often ask about benchmarks for behavior. I will say there's no published benchmark that says kids should do X. And so what happens is the benchmarks for this are often peer norms, right? So in our school, typically 80% of kids, or 80% of the time, kids are academically engaged. So that can become a comparison for a kid who's below peer expectations. And you'll see here where we're setting the goal is still set at a certain level, but instead of, for example, using the star, you know, at the end where we're progressing towards that, we're instead using sort of a benchmark that's moving up to see, are we getting the kids closer to that? So nice thing, they're really easy to use. Most tools already have them, but there are some points in time, particularly kids who are in your intensive intervention or tier 3, in which a benchmark is just not realistic, right? The kid is 3 grade levels behind. And if I could get kids caught up 3 grade levels in a single year, I would probably be a miracle worker, right? So sometimes we might have to use off grade level benchmarks. So if I have a 9th grader reading on a 2nd grade level, I'm going to look at benchmarks where I expect the kid to end up, right? So if I think, wow, if I can really move this kid 2 levels of growth in reading, I might set the benchmark or look at the benchmarks for 4th grade when I'm setting my off grade level goal, right? But I just have to really have strong data to justify that. And if you're setting off grade level benchmarks for kids who are not already identified under IDEA, you really need to consider whether this is a student with a disability because the discrepancy is so far. So the other option, and you're going to have an opportunity to try this out, so pay attention, is the use of weekly rates of improvement. And this is a really good strategy if you're looking at determining whether a kid is making adequate progress that may, you know, or not making adequate progress that may get us to think, is this a student with a disability? And when I say that is that we look at average growth. Right, so benchmark is where we want kids to be, but we also want kids to be making growth that's similar to their peers. And so most tools right now have a growth rate that we would expect by grade span, by measure. And we can use that growth rate to say, can this kid progress at the same rate as their peers? Maybe the benchmark is way too high because, well, they were homeschooled and they just didn't get good instruction. And so they've got the discrepancy, but it's really a discrepancy as a result of lack of opportunity, not necessarily some learning difference. So that's where rates of improvement can be helpful. Now the formula is pretty standardized and it's in that handout that's in the book, but it looks at the rate of improvement that's published. And I'll show you where you can get those, times the number of weeks in which, you know, we go from baseline to goal. And then we add the baseline score. So the first two, the rate of improvement times weeks, is really looking at what is the number or the points I expect to see from baseline to the goal. And then we're adding the baseline so that I can actually find the goal that I'm going to put on my sheet. So here's an example, the rate of improvement for math calculation, and we look at that as digits, would be 2 digits per week. I have a 10-week intervention. So I'm going to multiply those two together, gives me 20. The kid's baseline was already 30, so I could set a goal at 50. Now, what this doesn't do is get the kid to benchmark, right? And the reason I might use rate of improvement is because the benchmark is not really feasible right now. The kid is struggling, and I'm just trying to understand, can this kid make growth similar to their peers? There are tools like AimsWeb, FastBridge. Most of the tools that use CBM have published rates of growth, unless it's a measure that's criterion. So that would be like a letter naming fluency, letter sound fluency. Those measures don't tend to have rates of growth because it's about meeting expected criteria. But if you look at reading, like your proficiency in reading, there's a really big average range. And you can be a good reader and make, you know, a certain level of growth and be a great reader, meet a certain level of growth and still be what we see as average. Something to consider is which rates of growth. I always recommend using the mean for this. And that's because if you look at, well, what if I just use the growth rate that's relevant to where the kid is? If the kid is at the 10th percentile and you use the growth rate of kids at the 10th percentile, pretty much you're just maintaining the 10th percentile. And that doesn't really close the gap. But if you look at the average growth, right, for those at the 50th percentile, that really may not be realistic for the student. So your team has to really be confident in why you're choosing the rate of growth that you're choosing. If you don't have rates of improvement, you can actually create your own rates of improvement if you have benchmarks. So if you know benchmark 1 is the benchmark score is here and the second benchmark is here, you can just subtract the lower from the higher and then divide that by the number of weeks. And that gives you a general sense about what would be sort of realistic growth for students. So how do you set the goals? Pretty much biggest thing first is find the rates of growth. There are published rates of growth in the literature. It's really hard to find, but there are some places that you can locate them, and I'll show you some examples on the tools chart. But if you're trying to use rates of growth and you have a published tool and you can't find it, contact your publisher and say, look, I really want to know what's your average rate of growth for kids in 3rd grade. And that will allow you to set goals. I caution about using recommended goals from a published system unless you understand where that rate of growth came from. Because each tool uses different calculations, and if you don't know why they use the calculation that they did, you may misinterpret that. So here's an example again. I've got rate of growth because you're going to do this, so pay attention. 1.5, and you can see I got that from the chart. This was a 2nd grader. The measure I chose was PRF. So 1.5, the number of weeks I have coming is 10 weeks. So I'd multiply those two together. It's our order of operations. And then I would add that to my, my actual goal itself. So what you see here then is I would use that calculation to set the goal. Okay. So there are some advantages. It does allow us to have a valid option for looking at a realistic goal for students, particularly those who cannot feasibly meet the benchmark in the instructional period. And it's really useful, I think, when you're at an IEP meeting, you can bring the benchmark and the rate of growth and really talk about, well, gosh, the benchmark for this grade is 90. If we did a rate of improvement goal for your student, they're at 50. So we have these two goal discrepancies, and then it allows the team to make a good decision about what is most appropriate for this kid. so that we're not entering an IEP meeting and saying, we're going to do this and here's why, but instead you're engaging the IEP team in that decision. There are some concerns though. If you use the average growth, pretty much you're just maintaining the discrepancy. You can get around that a little bit by taking average growth and bumping it up by half. But you just have to make sure first that the kid can make average growth before you start bumping it up. Now, I mentioned there are some places to find this, and if you're interested, just put in the chat box. But on the tools chart from the National Center on Intensive Intervention, there is a place under that usability tab in which you can find if your tool has rates of improvement and end of year, that's the EOY benchmarks. And the reason we require publishers to disclose that is because without that information, you'll have a lot of great data but have a really hard time understanding whether the data mean anything, right? Is the kid making progress, or all kids making progress? So what I'd like to do right now is I'm going to challenge you, and we're going to look to see who is our champion out of our group. And you have a handout. I also have it on the screen in case you can't see it. Just zoom in with your little plus sign. But what I'd like you to do is to identify the goal for this particular student. And I'm looking for the first person who can tell me what would be a realistic benchmark goal for this second grader, okay? So, or first grader. So she has been identified for intervention. You'll see at the top, there is some critical information that you will need to calculate your rate of improvement. You'll see that she read 23 words read correct at the benchmark for the fall or the winter, and there are only 16 weeks left in the intervention period. So if you can't remember the calculation, don't worry. There's a template in the lower right-hand corner. But now I'm going to give you just a little bit of time to put your answers in there. And if you can just, don't send it to everyone, just send it to Tom, and Tom's going to let me know, or send it to me. Let me know who got it first, but I don't want you to give it away to everybody. Nice, Megan. So I've already got my first entry. And Tom, you let me know if you get some others.
I will do.
Okay, I've got no one who's yet told me what they think is a reasonable benchmark goal for Jane. So you could be the first one. You can give me a thumbs up when you're ready and you've got those. That's in your, under your name, you'll see the thumbs up feature. Oh, heck. All right, Megan, so far you are my leaderboard. Okay, so how many of you put 60? You don't have to tell me, but you can just pat yourself on the back that you did a good job. And I want to just show real quickly where that came from. So these data, which is what a team, an intervention team or an IEP team would be looking at, is to say these are the end of the year benchmarks and growth rates by grade level. Now, if you look at Jane, right, she's a first grader. So we would go to the first grade level benchmark, and the measure is reading connected text. So that's what she's going to be monitored on. And the end of year benchmark is 60. And so it's pretty easy, right? We don't have to do any calculations. We're just going with what the benchmark is. Now, to really understand if that's a realistic goal, the best thing to do is to calculate a goal based on rates of weekly improvement. And both Megan and Heather, great work, is that 52. And that's because we probably wouldn't set a goal at 51.8, which you were correct, and we would instead round it. And sometimes people might round to 50 or to 55. But if you look at these two goals, that if we were to look at the options for goal setting for Jane, and we're sitting in an intervention meeting or we're sitting with parents, I could say, look, you know, the benchmark is 60. If she maintained adequate growth or same growth as her peers, she would get to 52. And then the team could work together and say it's realistic or expected that she would get to 60. Because she's a first grader for one, I don't want to lower the expectations. And what I would do then is say maybe she needs a little bit more intensification in her intervention to ensure that she's making more than average growth. Because if she just did average growth, she'll maintain the gap behind her peers and stay at 52. So that's where it helps you, for one, engage others in the goal setting process. And really understand what's going to work. Now, if this was, let's say, a 9th grader, what we would expect for growth might be a little bit different. And so the team may say, look, you know, based on the last 5 years of data, maintaining average growth is very challenging for the student. It is our goal. So then it would help us make a decision based on student performance of selecting a goal of 52 versus 60. Or rounding it, right? Let's do the middle ground at 55. So Tom, I want to just put you on the spot for a second, and I know you work with a lot of districts. What are you seeing in terms of their use of these two strategies?
We have, it's actually kind of interesting, even when we're using like the benchmark setting, a lot of our teachers that have become probably more savvy in the process have begun to also like double check their benchmark with a rate of improvement as well to see if it's something that's not only achievable but somewhat ambitious. I think the biggest question that's come out of this, at least for some of the teachers that I've worked with, is when is it appropriate, if at all, to lower a goal? So if they're using the standard measures, it provides a goal that it becomes obvious very quickly that perhaps the student will not achieve that. Is that a requirement more to, or is it required to revisit the intervention and maybe intensification there more? And they've had the question, because we know we can up the goal, but then the question is it ever appropriate to lower that goal?
That's a great question. And if you've used a validated approach, particularly when a student is not in special ed, and I will clarify, if the student is not in special ed, I would never lower the goal. And I would actually never lower the goal for a kid who's in special ed as well. But the reason you would not lower the goal for a kid who's not in special ed is because the reason we're collecting these data is to determine the student's response. And if the student cannot respond similar to their same age peers, that may be an indicator that this student's learning needs are different or than what can be provided in just general education alone. So if I know the benchmark is 60 and I'm setting a modified expectation, right, that's lower than what I would expect for other kids, I've in a sense changed the expectations or standards. And that's a big red flag, and we want to be very cautious. For kids with disabilities, what I would recommend is reconvene your IEP team meeting if you're concerned that maybe the goal was not appropriate. But as Tom mentioned, most of the time kids are not reaching their goals because of something on our end. Either the intervention wasn't designed appropriately to help the kid reach the goal, or maybe we're not implementing the intervention in a way that's going to maximize its benefits. But yeah, lowering the goal is, I would say, is really your ultimate last resort. And you've got to rule out design issues and fidelity issues before it's even considered for a particular student. Great question. All right, thanks. So there is a third option that you'll find in the academic book. And I'm going to give you an opportunity to do that and see how well it calculates. But it takes your knowledge of the rate of improvement approach to goal setting and moves it to a much more individualized nature. And there are some things about what this is called, right? Intra-individual framework, which means I'm comparing this student's progress to their previous progress, not to their peers and not to a national benchmark or norm. And so what I'm doing is I've created something that's very individualized, which probably limits its use for kids who are already identified as a student with a disability. If you were looking to use this approach and let's say with general education kids at tier 3, I would really caution against that, because what you've already done is set a below grade level expectation for the kid. And it comes back to that first example where I showed the 40. That was, I was setting a goal based on where I thought the kid could get to, but getting to that has no meaning for the kid because it's well below grade level expectations and doesn't even reflect grade level growth expectations. But it is used, particularly kids with more significant disabilities, or for kids in upper grades who have very severe discrepancies. And, you know, intensive intervention has not really resulted in their ability to meet the benchmark or to even meet grade level growth standards. So what it does require, though, is this calculation of a student rate of improvement. And to do that, we need about 8 data points, or we do need 8 data points. And to really, because these are not published, but to use those 8 data points to come up with a student level goal. So in this case, what we're looking at is trying to look at the rate of improvement from the first period to the last period, the 8th data point. And what you do is you subtract the lower data point from the higher data point and actually divide by 7, not 8, but 7, because it's representing 7 weeks of instruction. So you'll see this on the little template. And once I've done that, this student rate of improvement takes the place of what would have been a national norm or rate of improvement. I have to recalculate the baseline because I use the first 8 data points really to justify or identify a rate of improvement, and the baseline using either of the 2 measures we talked about before, the 3 data points, take the median or the mean, and select that baseline score. So we've got the 2 parts of the improvement. The other part is, right, the number of weeks. And so we calculate the number of weeks from this baseline to the goal and then use the calculation or formula that I showed. Now, before we do a little practice with it, I just want to point out some advantages. It is a valid option for kids in which national norms or for benchmarks or rate of improvements are not appropriate. But you have to really have ruled out everything else because what you're in a sense saying is that this student's expectations are below, right, what we would expect for grade level expectations, and you're not closing the gap. You're in a sense making the gap a little bit larger over time, because what you've not been able to do with rate of improvement is maintain the gap, or with benchmark, which is close the gap. It does require some calculation, and those of you who hate math will probably look at it and say, heck no, I'm going to let somebody else on my team figure that out. But it is a way for us to be able to not just make up some arbitrary goal, but to use what we know about student performance to create a realistic but ambitious goal. So I want to give folks an opportunity to try it out, to get a little guidance. If you are interested in this and you want to learn more, I do recommend contacting WDE. I know Tom has been doing a lot of work with local educators. There are some coaches within districts that have been working with local practitioners to use these goals when they're appropriate. All right, so I'm going to just give you some time to do that. And this would be a good time too. If you have questions, you can send those to Tom or you can send them to everyone. And feel free, if you're feeling super confident, to send your response to the entire group. Heather's already on it. All right, so I've got a couple. So what you'll see here is when we think about that rate of improvement, we're going to take the median of the first and last. And I just want to point out what that looks like is if you see these data points right here, the first three are underlined and the last three are underlined. So what we're looking for is the median score, right? So if I put them from lowest to highest, the middle score here would be 44. If I put these from lowest to highest, the middle score would be 37. So that's this trying to understand the slope, right, or the student's rate of improvement. So if we subtract those, we're going to divide by 7 weeks. And people always say, why the heck 7 weeks? There are 8 data points there. Remember, those 8 data points represent the beginning of 1 week and the end of the last week. But in between those two, it's only 7 weeks. So that's what we're looking at in terms of calculating the student rate of improvement. If we use that, what we end up getting is a rate of improvement of 1 for this student. The number of weeks based on the description was 10, and we knew the baseline score was 44. So looking at those data, we would take our rate of improvement, multiply it times 1.5. And the reason we multiply it times 1.5 is I don't want to maintain the same growth that you had. I need it to be more ambitious. So we're going to do same growth plus, right? We're going to do at least half, double that a little, or at least half of that more. Then we have our number of weeks plus our baseline to give us a goal of 59, which we would probably round to about 60. Now, this is where if you have a student who's really struggling and you're with a family at an IEP meeting and they want grade level expectations, this is where you can diffuse some of that situation and say, look, we've calculated the goals based on what we know. Here's the benchmark, here's the national norm rate of improvement, what it would be, and here is the current performance, what we would expect if we had ambitious growth. And that way it's not being perceived as what you think the goal should be. It's saying these are some validated strategies that offer us some ways to look at how do we set this goal. So I haven't had any questions yet, so I'm hoping either you're still there or it's so interesting that they just don't have any questions yet. But please type in any questions that you have. Something you probably noticed about this and what is the baseline? Oh, good question. So there's a question about baseline. So remember, I'm going to go back to the graph here. The baseline has to recalculate based on the last 3 data points. And remember, we can use mean or median. And so in this case, we take the last 3 data points and we take the median score, which is 44, and 44 becomes the baseline. right? We don't want to use this up front because this was based on previous performance. What we're looking at is the most recent performance in order to set baseline. Hope that helps. Okay. Now, something that's really critical about goal setting is, especially for interpretation, if we don't graph it, it doesn't really mean anything. And there's a lot of research in this area, both for students graphing their own data and teachers graphing data. And most of the data systems right now do that. It's why you often purchase a data system, so that when you put in the raw numbers, it will give you a line towards the goal that you have. And when you go to an IEP meeting, it's really important to have a visual about what's going to happen. Because if you show up and the goal is like this, right, it's very vertical, then it means it's probably not realistic. Or if it's super flat, it might also be an indication that the tool or the measure we've set is not sensitive enough to really measure that student's progress towards that goal. You can always do things by hand. There's nothing anywhere that says doing it by hand is bad. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that doing it by hand actually leads to better adherence, because I can do it in real time, and I can share it with the student, which then has its own moderate effect, right? It's monitoring the progress. Tom?
No, I was just going to add that one of the things that we had run into is with graphing, even when they had an off-the-shelf tool that graphed for them, if they allowed the student to graph their own progress, there was significant buy-in as well to the student with the process.
Yeah, and it's helping the student understand why the goal is where it's at, right? I think we do a lot of things and we make assumptions, which I refer to as assume-aside, that they know why that goal is where it's at. Right. And if you can tell a student, yeah, if you reach this goal, we can, go to less intensive supports. Maybe we don't have to do intervention every day, or we can move into a different setting. And I know, Tom, you all saw this in the video with one of your students. So, but NCII does have a free graphing tool. It's being updated and revised because Excel changes its security features all the time. But you can currently use our form right now to progress monitor students. And the thing about graphing that's necessary for helping us understand the meaning of the goal is it's that goal line that goes from the baseline to the goal. It's almost like the road that we need to take. And it helps us see right away whether we're getting off the road and we're not going to reach that goal, or like Tom mentioned, maybe we're like going up the mountain faster than we thought we were going to be, and we can actually get to that goal much more quickly and shorten the intervention, or maybe increase the goal. If we used rate of improvement, we had a lower, we didn't do grade level benchmark, that rate of improvement, the kid is exceeding it, then we might be able to then change the goal to be benchmarked, to be a much higher expectation. So I'll just close up and say, the way we write the goal matters. I know those of you who are in special ed, of course, you know that the goal matters, but it has a lot of relevance for just general intervention goal writing as well. Because if we don't clarify the condition under which this goal is set, or clarify the expectation or the measure, right? That was that first step we talked about, and the level of proficiency, it becomes really challenging for us to use the goal. And I think the whole point of goal setting, like Hattie talks about in his visible learning, is to make it very clear where we're all going, whether it's the parent, the student, or the teacher, and that we have a common understanding and that we can then work together to help the student reach that goal. If we all have different interpretations of the goal, that's where we get in trouble. And some of those interpretations come from using invalid measures or measures that are really meant for monitoring progress and not progress monitoring. So we know that quality goals really address sort of four main things, and you'll see these in the resources that I shared with you. The first is addressing the condition, and it's really clarifying under what condition are you doing this, right? Is it a certain grade level? You know, is it a ninth grader who's actually using a second grade probe or a fourth grade probe? You need to clarify that in the goal. You can't just arbitrarily say, you know, it's 56 is the benchmark we're going to use. It's really on second grade, this type of measure, the student will, and then being clear about what it is they're going to do. Read connected text, identify, you know, words or math calculation, or engage in a certain type of behavior, and then clarifying what that level of proficiency is. And I think that level of proficiency is what we're looking at. We're looking at 56 words read correctly with a certain level of accuracy. If it's, you know, math, it's a certain number of digits with a certain level of proficiency. And proficiency matters. It's not just can they learn that we're trying to set goals for, is the instruction and the learning that they're doing leading them to progress towards something that's going to help them better access and progress in the core instruction, and be a better student overall, right? So in both of the guides, you'll see some examples. I do caution about using templated goals. I do a lot of case law review. It's really what part of the Progress Center does. And we want to make sure they are individualized. With that said, there are structures, right, or templates that can help you still maintain that individualization, right? So it may be that everybody's goal structure looks the same. That's completely fine. But the numbers and the criterion and the measures, you have to be able to justify why you're using those for that particular student. If it's a student with an IEP, that would be in the class. If it's a student who's in your tier 2 or tier 3 intervention, then that's part of the rationale for why the student is getting intervention in the first place. So I just like to take a quick sort of like your closing quiz, is give me a sample goal, and you can make it up or rethink a certain goal that you have, whether it's a tier 2, tier 3 intervention or an IEP goal, or maybe it's a weight loss goal that you're working on, but a goal that sort of clarifies this condition, the behavior, and the level of proficiency. And if you don't necessarily know the benchmarks, you can put a little X there, but what it does clarify is what you're going to do, right? I'm going to structure the goal in this way. And I need at least 3 of them in order for you all to get your ticket out the door. And Heather and Megan, you've been my star students. So if others want to join into the star student category, this will be a good time to share your sample goal. No pressure. Yes, thank you, Megan. So the student will solve 10 3-digit addition and subtraction problems with regrouping. So the one thing I would say is that condition itself is just being maybe a little bit more clear, but you've got the proficiency, you've got the behavior, you've got the goal itself that we're expecting. Awesome. So we've got a math example. Any other examples? And this applies, I will say, the same structure for kids. My background, I actually started in low incidence disabilities for kids with the most severe cognitive disabilities. And so the same structure applies. And when we use a standard structure, it makes the process a lot easier. Kelsey, when given a 5th grade level Ames web probe, reading fluent, you've got that perfect condition. Student will read 105 words per minute with 98% accuracy, and you've got the date. So got all those components in there. Thanks, Kelsey. All right, we just need one more. Thanks, Joelle. So when given a 9th grade narrative text, so we've got the condition. Student will answer 8 out of 10. So we're telling what's the observable behavior. That's the goal that we're looking for. And you've got some of that accuracy. Yep, and I've gotten some private ones too. So, and the same process. I thank you, Heather, so much for sharing this. This applies whether the kids are in pre-K, transition. I use it for my own self. Awesome. See one more, sorry, I lost it when the last one came. Jonathan, awesome. Yeah. Yeah, so do you have any tools to help with the writing of the goals? The 2 handouts that I gave you include some sample templates to help you do that with some sample wording. Both, there's one for academic goal setting, and then there's one for behavioral goal setting. There are also several, not writing them, for writing, yes. I will show you exactly where, so I'm sorry this is moving so fast, but I do want to just share this resource because you can do this for both writing and spelling. So I think that's kind of what you're talking about. And this tool right here, it's at interventioncentral.com. It is a sort of free resource, but it includes written expression. I think that's what you're getting at. What are some benchmarks that you can use? There's also a tool or a book called The ABCs of CBM that has the sample benchmarks and rates of growth for tools that are not very common. Like maybe you have a spelling IEP goal or a writing goal that's more about written production versus accuracy or grammar. So they have some of those that are available. Okay. Oh, and I see Dina also put some goal writing strategies and from WinWeb, you can see those. But yeah, from a content standpoint, that is a resource that's specific to that content area. Hopefully that helps. I lose my thing starts scrolling faster. So you are likely to also come across some areas in which there are no goals or no benchmarks or rates of improvement. And I think we see that more with behavior or kids with significant disabilities. And this is where it's more on the teacher to really be clear about the outcome. Because I can take, let's say, I'll just take a student who's working on a life skill of making mac and cheese or something. I can break that task down into steps and create a goal and say, you know, I want 100% of these steps done at this period of time, because you have to do all the steps to make whatever it is. Or if there are some steps that could be skipped, then maybe I could justify it's 90%. But for those, it just requires us to really understand the curriculum and to understand what's a realistic expectation for the kid. All right, so I'll just leave it open to see if there's any questions. Feel free to send them directly to Tom or myself. You can see in the chat box if you're wanting your PTSB credit or STARS credit, the links are in there. Yes, Jackie, the preschool one is the next one. Is that correct, Tom? There's a preschool goal writing?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am, that is correct. I believe that's scheduled for, I'm going to double check my calendar here real quick, but I believe that's in January.
Yeah. But Jackie, I will say that there's a couple of other preschool folks on this, that the IGDs actually have those published norms for early childhood measures, actually from birth to 5. And I don't know, there are a couple of folks on here if you want to share in the chat box your experiences using IGDs. I know there are 2 folks on the call. But it also has measures for behavior, social emotional, physical growth. Like they're measures or benchmarks that are unique to that particular grade span. The DBR too that I shared is also something that can be easily adapted for preschool settings when you're looking at like the academic engagement. You know, one of the things that we're looking at with pre-K students is to be able to move into this new world of K-12 and be a successful student, which is more than just academics and behavior. And so the DBR can be adapted for that. Great. So yeah, so you'll see in there that Corinne will share if you want to email her about some benchmarks for pre-K. Any other questions or comments?
Dr. Bailey, I did want to go ahead and verify that the early childhood goal writing session will be on January 29th.
But if you need some beforehand, Corinne put her email address in the chat box, and they've been working on that for about a year.
I'm going to go ahead and add mine as well. If they have any other questions, they're more than welcome to contact me.
Great. Well, no other questions, and if you have a couple, just let me know. But I just wanted to share there are a bunch of more resources in the back of both of the guides that I shared with you. That if you really want to learn more about those, but Tom put his email address in the chat box as well, and you have a Wyoming Department of Ed that's really well versed in what's available. So please use the resources to contact them. The Wyoming WIN website has a plethora of tools, and the links have been in the chat box as well. And I will just sort of summarize by, it's really about just best practice is making sure the goals are on what we expect the kid to do, not what we want to do, right? We want to make sure that they're set in a way that we can monitor them frequently enough for them to matter, right? And we want to be able to use those for making instructional and intervention decisions. And we also want them to be based on a valid and reliable measure, because if you set a goal based on a measure that is not really relevant, then you're working towards something that has no meaning for a particular student or their family. And finally, I will just, think about that last goal in regards to Endrew Supreme Court decision, is make sure that they are realistic but ambitious. If we are not raising the expectations for students who are struggling, then they're not going to be able to compete with their grade level peers. And so thinking about these validated goal setting strategies that can help you really make a decision about what's realistic for this student and what's ambitious for the student in light of their circumstances. But just a couple of things. This webinar will be recorded and posted. The guides I've shared with you. Just a reminder, the tools chart is there if you want to check out your particular tool. And then the IRIS Center is another great resource, and it will be linked in the PowerPoint that's posted. There's a resource for administrators to really think about their role in helping facilitate ambitious goal setting, and then a resource that dives more deeply into IEPs around why does this goal matter in terms of the services that we provide. Right, and finally, I will just close. As Tom mentioned, I am the director of the new Progress Center. For those of you who are working with students with disabilities, either in general ed or special ed, this center is really about promoting progress for students with disabilities. We will have a number of events coming up beginning in November through January. They are free events that will be sharing resources, tools for promoting progress. And so you will be getting a link. There will be a national call for folks. But the other thing about that is those who attend those events can also, if they're interested, partner with the center for more direct supports and services. It's not specific to the IEP. It's really around designing high quality educational programming, which includes the IEP, but also includes the implementation of the program that you put in place. So our ticket out the door, we're gonna do that chatter fall again. And so what I'd like you to do is in the chat box, don't push enter yet, is just write up to 3 words that sort of summarize a takeaway from today. And then we'll use the magic word before you select enter. I'll give you a couple of seconds to get your 3 words of your takeaway. All right, here's the magic word. Goals. So push your enter button. I love it. Close the gap, work to do, measurement tool baseline, thorough, applicable, yes, meaningful, excellent. Well, I want to thank all of you, and I think Tom has a formal closing, but I do want to thank you for allowing me to share these resources today, and I look forward to future sessions.
Dr. Bailey, thank you very much for your time today and sharing your expertise with us. We would also like to thank all of those that participated by learning, making comments, and of course, asking questions.